My name is Miller Files, and this is where I reopen a case America has heard too many times, yet understood far too little. When I began to study the original documents from the Casey Anthony case, I didn't just look at evidence. I looked at time, because in an investigation, time is the only witness that never lies. People can lie, memories can distort, but time never betrays us, and time reveals more than anyone expected about the last day of young Caylee Anthony, June 16th, 2008. For most people, it was an ordinary summer day in Orlando, Florida. But for the Anthony family, it was the day truth began to twist. It was the day a chain of events unfolded so quietly that the silence itself became a warning sign. I read every detail in the reports, from the grandparents' statements to Casey's shifting explanations, and the thing that struck me most was the stillness. No screams, no neighbors raising alarm, no ambulance, no sign of a child in trouble. Everything appeared painfully normal, and that, in any investigation, is the first sign of deception. A perfectly calm day before a tragedy is the kind of quiet that forces investigators like me to pause and question everything. The morning began like countless others. George Anthony left early for work. Cindy Anthony went to her job. Casey remained in the house with her daughter. None of this was unusual. In multi-generational households, it's standard for a child to spend mornings with their mother. But the issue wasn't the routine. It was Casey's overall pattern of behavior in the months leading up to that day. She didn't have a job at Universal Studios, though she insisted she did. She had crafted lie upon lie long before June 16th. Lies aren't built in a day. They pile up until the truth is buried under their weight. I often think about how some people can sustain lies for so long. I've interrogated suspects who crumble in minutes, and I've met others who construct entire worlds around their falsehoods. Casey belonged to the latter group. She didn't just lie. She created an alternative reality detailed enough for her family to believe, but detailed stories can be the most dangerous. Real life is messy. Lies are smooth, and Casey's lies were polished like a screenplay. Witnesses saw Caylee playing happily that morning. No one noticed anything off, but the real turning point came that afternoon. According to phone records and later testimony, Casey left the house with Caylee sometime early in the afternoon. From that moment on, no one besides Casey ever saw the little girl alive again. That window of time between leaving the house and Casey's return without her daughter became one of the darkest voids in the entire case. A void where anything could have happened. A void where investigators later realized everything must have happened. That evening, instead of calling police, Casey went to her boyfriend Tony Lazzaro's apartment. Witnesses recall nothing unusual about her behavior. They watched movies, ate dinner, slept together. Casey acted like nothing in her life was wrong. She told Tony that Caylee was with the nanny. Her voice was calm, her demeanor steady. In photos taken later that week, she looked carefree, smiling, dancing, posing at parties. This is not the behavior of a mother whose child is in danger. In my years working cases involving missing children, genuine fear is unmistakable. It floods every word, every gesture. Mothers don't sleep peacefully when they don't know where their 2-year-old is. They don't dance. They don't laugh. They don't laugh. They don't put on new clothes and head to clubs. But Casey did. In the days that followed, Casey's actions grew more concerning. She borrowed a friend's car. She asked for gas. She left the family's Pontiac abandoned in a parking lot. Every move she made felt like a deliberate step away from her daughter, as though she wanted distance. Every phone call she made to her parents that morning now seems less like genuine concern and more like an attempt to build a timeline, a crafted narrative meant to suggest she was checking in. A suspect who makes calls at specific times without any real conversation is a suspect creating alibis, not seeking help. The more I studied June 16th, the more I understood why the case spiraled the way it did. It wasn't just what happened that day. It was what didn't happen. Casey didn't pack clothes for Caylee. She didn't take toys. She didn't bring snacks. She didn't tell anyone where she and Caylee were going. In the world of missing children investigations, mothers cling to every detail. Casey ignored every detail. Later testimony showed that George Anthony's last memory of Caylee was of a healthy, cheerful little girl. No signs of illness. No sign of distress. That tells us something vital. Whatever happened to her did not begin earlier. There was no gradual decline, no warning. It was sudden, abrupt. And it happened when she was alone with Casey. June 16th was the last day anyone saw Caylee alive. And the worst part is how normal the day looked on the outside. But in the quiet moments between morning and night, something irreversible happened. Something Casey has never admitted. Something that changed the course of every life connected to that little girl. The 31 days that followed June 16th became the darkest corridor in the entire case. Not because of what was known, but because of what was never explained. In any investigation involving a missing child, the first hour is critical. The first 24 hours are life-saving. But 31 days without a report, without a search, without a phone call to police is not merely suspicious. It is unheard of. As I read the timeline again and again, I felt a growing sense of unease. These 31 days weren't blank spaces. They were loud in their absence of concern. Every action Casey took during that period said something about her state of mind, and none of it resembled the frantic desperation of a mother trying to find her daughter. On June 17th, instead of returning home or reaching out to her parents, Casey stayed with her boyfriend. Over the next days, she was seen shopping, clubbing, drinking, dancing, and making plans with friends. She told people that Caylee was with a babysitter named Zanny. The more she repeated the lie, the more it became the foundation of her new narrative. I've studied many suspects who bury the truth beneath the story they've rehearsed. Casey not only rehearsed it, she lived inside it. Each retelling was as casual and confident as the one before. The photographs from that period are among the most haunting pieces of this entire case. Casey with her arms around friends, smiling into cameras, wearing outfits meant for carefree nights, competing in a nightclub event. Nothing in those images shows fear, grief, or panic. They show a young woman who appears unburdened. And in missing child investigations, that is a red flag no professional ever ignores. Every person who interacted with Casey during those weeks said the same thing. She acted normal. Her voice was calm. Her eyes were steady. She never mentioned distress, never spoke about searching for her daughter, never asked for help. She maintained the story that Caylee was with the nanny, even though she never attempted to contact this nanny in front of anyone. Not once. That is not a mother whose child has suddenly gone silent. That is a person performing a version of life in which the child is simply absent. The pattern continued as the weeks passed. Casey moved between friends' homes and her boyfriend's apartment. She borrowed cars, borrowed gas, continued lying about where she worked and who she saw. She carried on with a lifestyle incompatible with the claim that her daughter was safely being cared for by someone else. One of the small but powerful moments that stood out to me was when Caylee returned home briefly to pick up some clothes. Cindy recalled that Caylee kept her distance from the Pontiac. She avoided opening the trunk. She seemed uncomfortable being near it. People avoid what they fear, and people fear what they know. Caylee wasn't avoiding the trunk because the smell was unfamiliar. She avoided it because the smell was familiar. The date of July 4th remains a marker in the public memory. A photo from a party that night shows Caylee laughing, her expression relaxed, her eyes bright. The contrast between her demeanor and the reality of her missing daughter is jarring. But for investigators, it tells a consistent story. Caylee's behavior did not belong to someone hoping to find her child alive. Around mid-July, the situation reached a point where the lies could no longer hold. Friends started questioning why they hadn't seen Caylee. Cindy demanded to know where her granddaughter was. Caylee spun variations of the Zanny story, saying the babysitter was out of town, busy, or unavailable. She had an excuse for every moment. Yet she showed no effort to produce the child. Eventually, the Pontiac was towed for being abandoned. When Cindy retrieved it from the impound lot, the smell hit her immediately. She knew what decomposition smelled like, and the scent filled the air the moment the door opened. Her voice on the 911 call was desperate and trembling when she said it smelled like a dead body had been in the car. That single sentence became the turning point of the entire investigation. For the first time, someone said out loud what evidence had been hinting at all along. When officers questioned Caylee later that night, she did not break. She told the same story she had told for a month. The nanny had Caylee. The nanny had gone missing. She had been trying to find her on her own. She had been scared. None of it fit the evidence. None of it matched her behavior. Yet she continued speaking, as though the words alone could make her lies true. When Caylee walked investigators through the apartment complex where the supposed nanny lived, she recited the story with unwavering confidence. But no one named Zainaida had ever lived there. No one had ever seen Caylee with a child in that complex. And the moment the officers pressed her, Caylee's facade cracked just enough to show the truth underneath. She admitted she didn't know where Zanny really lived. She admitted she didn't know how to contact her. She admitted she didn't have her number. The perfect imaginary sitter collapsed in seconds. But what stands out about those admissions is what didn't happen. Caylee didn't cry. She didn't panic. She didn't show the fear of a mother suddenly facing the possibility that her daughter might be in danger. Instead, she remained strangely composed. Some suspects lose their lies violently. Others let them slip like shedding skin. Caylee did the latter. Investigators noticed something else during these 31 days. Caylee's story never showed the emotional agility of a frightened parent. It showed the rigid consistency of a lie told so often that the liar begins to rely on it to survive. She didn't grieve. She didn't search. She didn't display a single instinct that a mother missing her child would show. Time is unforgiving in cases like this. Bodies decompose. Clues fade. Witnesses forget. And the clock that began ticking on June 16th would come back to haunt the investigation. Had a report been filed that day, or even a few days later, the truth might have been recoverable. But 31 days allowed the evidence to rot along with Caylee's small body in the Florida heat. When police confronted Caylee, she stuck to her script. Even when she led officers into Universal Studios and wandered the hallways pretending she belonged there, she continued the act. When she finally stopped walking, she turned around and confessed she didn't work there. She had never worked there. She had lied about everything, and she said it with the calmness of someone admitting to misplacing a set of keys, not the someone whose entire life was unraveling. As the investigation deepened, the 31 days of silence became the most critical section of the timeline. Not for what Caylee did, but for everything she didn't do. No mother who believes her child is alive behaves as Caylee behaved. No mother imagines she can search for a missing child by drinking at bars, dancing at clubs, and sleeping at her boyfriend's apartment. These 31 days revealed who Caylee had become long before the world realized it. A person who had already disconnected from her role as a mother. A person who saw freedom where others saw responsibility. A person who chose to build a separate reality rather than face the truth of what she had done. By the time the 911 call was made, the 31 days were over, but the damage done in that silence would echo through every step of the investigation that followed. And the choices made during those 31 days would determine not only how Caylee died, but how the world would come to understand her death. The point where suspicion hardened into something darker began with the Pontiac Sunfire. The abandoned car, retrieved from the impound lot by Cindy Anthony, held within it the first undeniable sign that Caylee was not simply missing. It held a smell that no one who has encountered death can ever forget. The odor of decomposition is singular, heavy, sweet, penetrating. It clings to fabric and seeps into the air in a way that cannot be confused with rotting food or garbage. It is the silent witness that tells the truth before any detective ever can. When Cindy opened the car door, that smell hit her like a wave. Her voice cracked on the 911 call when she said the words that redirected the entire investigation. "It smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." It was a sentence that cut through every lie that had been told for 31 days. Once decomposition enters the narrative, the case shifts from missing person to probable homicide. When officers arrived to question Caylee, her calmness stood out immediately. She repeated her story about the nanny. She explained Caylee's absence with the same ease she had used throughout the previous month. She did not react to the mention of the car's smell. She did not ask what her mother meant. Instead, she seemed annoyed by the pressure. That lack of alarm was not an oversight. It was a statement in itself. People fear the unknown. They fear what they cannot explain. Caylee showed no such fear because the truth did not surprise her. It confirmed what she already knew. Investigators pressed her for details. The nanny's address, her phone number, a timeline. Caylee offered vague answers, shifting explanations, and contradictions. When they asked her to take them to where she claimed Zanny lived, she complied readily, leading them to an apartment complex that had no record of anyone by that name ever residing there. No resident recognized her description. No one recalled seeing Caylee with a child. It was a lie so fragile it collapsed under the slightest pressure. Yet Caylee did not fall apart. She did not cry or panic. She simply adjusted, inch by inch, as though the unraveling of her story was something she had rehearsed. As investigators pushed, she continued layering new details on top of old fabrications. But each new layer was thinner than the last. Lies have a lifespan. Caylee's were reaching the end of theirs. Then came the moment that revealed the depth of her deception. She led detectives through the corridors of Universal Studios, pretending to work there. She waved at security guards, took confident steps, and navigated the hallways as though she belonged. When she reached a dead end, she paused, turned, and confessed she had lied about working there. It was not a panicked confession. It was almost casual, as if acknowledging something inconsequential. That moment told investigators everything they needed to know about the nature of her lies. They were not slips. They were structures, carefully built, habitually maintained. As the investigation progressed, forensic teams opened the trunk of the Pontiac. Inside, they found traces that spoke louder than words. A single strand of brown hair matching Caylee's. The root showed characteristics of post-mortem banding, a pattern that appears only after death. The trunk liner contained chemical markers associated with human decomposition. A piece of paper had absorbed fluids that aligned with the breakdown of organic material, and although a bag of trash had been left inside, its contents were insufficient to produce the strength of odor that officers reported. The hair evidence alone was devastating. Hair shed after death behaves differently at a microscopic level. No mother misplaces her daughter's body in a trunk without knowing it, and no lie can erase the science that reveals the timeline of decomposition. Casey continued to deny everything, but the car had already spoken. Investigators then turned their attention to the Anthony home. In the computer's browser history, they found searches for how to make chloroform and queries about household weapons, neck breaking, and suffocation. These searches occurred within the months leading up to Caylee's disappearance. There was no benign explanation for them, no household need, no coincidence. They were purposeful, and they shadowed Casey's narrative like a warning no one had heard in time. When questioned, Casey claimed she did not make those searches. She suggested her mother might have done it, but the timestamps lined up with times Casey was known to be home alone. The connection between chloroform and the decompositional compounds found in the car became one more piece in an evolving theory that Caylee had been incapacitated, silenced, or killed before her body was placed in the trunk. To investigators, the absence of visible trauma on the skeletal remains did not weaken the case. A body left in the Florida summer for months would not preserve evidence of asphyxiation, smothering, or poisoning. But the behaviors surrounding the disappearance are as telling as any wound. Casey had 31 days to create distance, 31 days to pretend nothing had happened, 31 days to live as though she had been waiting for this freedom. Interviews with friends and acquaintances painted the same disturbing picture. They described a young woman who never appeared distressed, who never expressed worry about her daughter, who never once mentioned that she was actively searching for her. She carried herself as someone who had already closed that chapter. A person does not forget a missing child, but a person who no longer considers the child a part of their daily life can act exactly as Casey did. The moments leading up to Casey's arrest reveal how disconnected she truly was. Cindy begged her to produce Caylee. Friends demanded answers. Casey deflected, manipulated, excused, lied. She maintained stories that no longer matched evidence, yet she refused to stop telling them, as though abandoning the narrative meant confronting something terrifying. When investigators reviewed Casey's demeanor in the early jailhouse conversations recorded between her and her parents, they observed something stark. Casey's frustration centered on how others were responding to her, not on what might have happened to her daughter. She complained about her treatment, her discomfort, and the disbelief surrounding her. She never once displayed the kind of emotional devastation or urgency one sees in truly desperate parents. Her reactions fit the pattern, not of an overwhelmed mother, but of a person whose focus was entirely self-centered. Every lie she had told for a month had been designed to protect herself from consequences, not to protect a missing child. Search teams scoured woods, swamps, and retention ponds across Orlando. Thousands of man-hours were invested, but the weeks of silence had already done their damage. The heat, humidity, and storms of Florida's summer act quickly on the remains of a small child. Time, more than any suspect, became the accomplice that erased answers. Investigators understood they were no longer searching for a child. They were searching for a body. The 31 days had closed the window for rescue, closed the window for precise forensic analysis, closed the window for truth written in the physical body of the victim. What remained were behaviors, lies, timelines, and a car that told the truth more clearly than Caylee ever would. And then came December, and with it, the discovery that would strip away the final layer of uncertainty. December arrived with a stillness that settled over Orlando like a long-held breath. The search efforts that had once spread across the city had dwindled, not because anyone had given up, but because there had been nothing left to find. The summer storms, the marshy terrain, the thick underbrush, and the oppressive heat had erased more clues than investigators could uncover. But on December 11, 2008, a break came from the most unassuming source. A utility worker checking drainage paths near a wooded area less than a few hundred yards from the Anthony home. The man noticed something half buried beneath wet leaves and muddy soil. At first glance, it looked like a torn trash bag. But when he stepped closer, the shape inside caught his attention. A small, pale, rounded object. Something that did not belong. When he leaned in, realization struck with the unmistakable weight of horror. It was a skull, the skull of a child. He backed away and called law enforcement. The call that followed redefined the entire narrative. The woods where the remains were found were dense, low-lying, and prone to flooding. In the rainy season, that patch of land transformed into a shallow swamp. During drier weeks, the ground hardened, just enough for debris to scatter across the surface. What investigators found when they arrived was a scene that nature had attempted to reclaim. Bones had been scattered by weather and animals. The skull was separated from the rest of the skeleton, leaves packed into cavities. The small jawbone still partially held by roots and debris, and around that fragile skull was the detail that would become iconic for its grim clarity. A strip of duct tape adhered to the lower portion of the face, stretched across where the mouth and nose would have been. The tape was 3 layers thick, the adhesive degraded by months of rain and heat. It was not a remnant of packaging. It was not an accident. It served one purpose, and that purpose eliminated any possibility of an innocent explanation. As forensic experts began sorting through the remains, they uncovered a series of disturbing consistencies. The child's bones were found inside a torn trash bag. That bag was placed within a laundry bag. Both the trash bag and the laundry bag were later matched to items found inside the Anthony home. The laundry bag was one of a matching pair, the other still inside the house. The trash bag had an identical pattern to those used by the family. These were not random choices by a stranger. These were household items. Items accessible only to someone who lived in that environment. Items that signaled familiarity. Mixed among the remains were pieces of clothing consistent with a little girl's wardrobe, tiny shorts, a shirt, and then something that stopped several investigators cold, a small blanket decorated with Winnie the Pooh. It matched patterns from Caylee's bedroom. Children become attached to their blankets. Parents know the importance of them. The presence of that blanket beside skeletal remains left no room for doubt. This was Caylee. The duct tape became the centerpiece of forensic analysis. Degradation made it impossible to detect fingerprints or DNA on its surface, but the placement itself carried its own message. Tape across the face of a child is not a panicked act. It is a silencing, a method of control, a barrier against breath. Experts testified that its location ruled out accident. A drowning victim does not end up with duct tape around their mouth. A child who wanders off does not wrap herself in tape. Even the defense struggled to find an alternative explanation. The environment had done what Florida environments do. It had stripped away soft tissue, eliminated visible trauma, removed any trace of chemicals that may have been present. Bones alone do not record suffocation or poisoning, but the context, the positioning, and the items surrounding the remains build a narrative stronger than bruises or fractures. Still, forensic scientists could not conclusively name a cause of death. The skeleton was too incomplete, the decomposition too advanced. Time, humidity, and rain had erased the most vital evidence. And although the absence of a cause of death frustrated investigators, it provided an opening for the defense that would later shape the outcome of the trial. When the remains were transported to the medical examiner's office, the Anthony family was notified. Cindy collapsed upon hearing the news. George withdrew into a silent grief that radiated through every interview he gave. They had hoped, irrationally but genuinely, that perhaps Caylee was still alive somewhere. That hope evaporated the moment the little skull was found in the mud. What replaced it was a crushing awareness that someone close to them was responsible. Casey's reaction, recorded through jailhouse logs and witness accounts, was markedly different. There was no outcry, no breakdown, no visible devastation, only a quiet, almost hollow acknowledgement of what had been found. She listened, she nodded, she did not weep. This response troubled investigators. A mother learning that her child's remains had been discovered would normally exhibit breakdown, denial, or inconsolable grief. Casey's controlled composure felt unnatural. It was the reaction of someone whose mind had already accepted the truth long before anyone else admitted it aloud. With the discovery of the remains, the state of Florida elevated the charges against Caylee. First-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, aggravated child abuse, providing false information to law enforcement, possibility of the death penalty. The case shifted from a missing child investigation to a homicide prosecution. Every move Caylee had made in the 31 days prior became evidence. Every lie became a pattern. Every attempt to misdirect became relevant. One of the most significant elements to emerge during this period was the computer search history taken from the Anthony home. Analysts found queries related to chloroform, neck breaking, and methods of sedation. Although the defense later argued over who performed these searches, the timestamps lined up with periods when Caylee was home alone. The connection between the searches and the potential method of incapacitation, especially when paired with decomposition chemicals in the trunk, reinforced investigators' beliefs that Caylee had not died accidentally. The presence of duct tape strengthened that conclusion. Yet, in the eyes of the law, suspicion is not proof, and without a known cause of death, the prosecution faced a dilemma. They had a body, they had behavior, they had the timeline, but they did not have a mechanism. In many jurisdictions, this gap alone can fracture a homicide case. Investigators also reflected on the disposal site. It was achingly close to the Anthony home, a 2-minute walk, a location so accessible that anyone familiar with the house would know it existed. This was not a remote swamp or a hidden landfill. It was a patch of woods visible from the road. A stranger would not choose it. Someone fearing discovery would not select such a public place. But someone acting in panic, someone having to act quickly, someone familiar with the neighborhood might choose the nearest spot that offered even minimal concealment. That realization weighed heavily on everyone involved. The person who disposed of Caylee's body chose the closest possible location, That choice indicated urgency, fear, and above all, familiarity. As preparations for trial began, one fact became clear to investigators. They believed wholeheartedly that Caylee Anthony was responsible for her daughter's death. But belief does not convict. Evidence convicts, and evidence, eroded by time and environment, left gaps that the legal system could not ignore. Those gaps became wedges that the defense would soon pry open. The discovery in the woods changed the direction of the case. But it also cemented one tragic truth. Caylee had not lived past that June day. Her short life had ended in silence, concealed beneath leaves and rainwater, while the world searched in the wrong places. No courtroom strategy, no legal argument, no televised debate could change what the bones in that shallow patch of woods had already revealed. But whether the legal system could transform those revelations into a conviction would be tested in the next phase as both sides prepared for one of the most watched trials in American history. By the time Caylee's remains were found in the wet woods near the Anthony home, the case had already consumed the attention of the nation. But the discovery marked the beginning of a different kind of battle, one not fought in forested ravines or evidence labs, but in a courtroom where every detail, every theory, every omission would be dissected in front of millions. It became clear that the truth of what happened to Caylee would not be decided by emotion or public outrage, but by what could be proven, refuted, or dismantled through legal strategy. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Spectators lined up hours before the doors opened, and cameras tracked every move made by the defendant. Caylee Anthony entered with a composed posture that puzzled many. Her expression was restrained, neither grief-stricken nor angry, neither frightened nor defensive. It was the face of someone who had learned to mask emotion behind a blank surface. Her parents sat behind her, their presence weighted with tension. Cindy clutched tissues. George barely lifted his eyes. The divide within the family was almost as visible as the divide the case had created across the country. The prosecution began by presenting what they believed was a coherent narrative. They argued that Caylee used chloroform or suffocation to incapacitate her daughter, suffocated her with duct tape, placed the body in the trunk of her car, and later discarded the remains in the woods. They relied on the pieces they could prove: the chloroform compounds detected in the car trunk, the duct tape on the remains, the decomposition odor, the postmortem hair, and the damning 31 days of silence. They walked the jury through Caylee's behavior, her lies, and the pictures of her partying, while her daughter was supposedly in the care of a nanny who did not exist. The case, though circumstantial, was built upon what investigators saw as a compelling structure of deception and concealment. But circumstantial evidence, no matter how strong, can falter when confronted with a skilled defense attorney. Jose Baez approached the jury with a very different story. He claimed that Caylee had drowned accidentally in the family pool, and that George Anthony helped cover it up. He suggested that Caylee had grown up in an environment of fear and manipulation, and that her lifelong habit of lying was not malicious but conditioned. He presented her behavior not as the actions of a killer, but of a young woman overwhelmed by dysfunction and trauma. It was a bold approach. There was no evidence Caylee drowned, no witness, no injury consistent with drowning, no mention of a pool accident in the 31 days that followed. Yet Baez knew that the state's case had gaps, and he aimed every argument directly at those openings. The cornerstone of his strategy was simple. If the prosecution could not show exactly how Caylee died, then they could not prove a premeditated murder. The duct tape became the most disputed piece of evidence. Prosecution experts testified that its placement was consistent with intentional suffocation. Baez countered that the tape could have adhered to the skull during decomposition, carried by the shifting of the environment, or placed by someone after death without malicious intent. His alternative explanations were scientifically weak, but the trial was not about scientific certainty. It was about whether the jury could say beyond a reasonable doubt that the prosecution's version was the only possible explanation. Then there was the smell in the Pontiac trunk. Expert witnesses described it as the unmistakable odor of human decomposition. Investigators testified to the same, but the defense argued that trash left in the trunk created the odor. They challenged the reliability of decomposition detection. They questioned whether the environment, heat, or contamination could have produced misleading results. Again, Baez did not have to prove his theory. He only had to make the jury think his theory could be true. The searches for chloroform and methods of incapacitation found on the Anthony family computer were introduced by the prosecution as prelude to murder. The defense countered with claims that the searches might have been made by someone else, or were misinterpreted, or were irrelevant to the case. When forensic evidence cannot identify the user behind a search term, speculation fills the void. And in a courtroom, speculation is a dangerous ally for any defense. But perhaps the most powerful tool Baez wielded was Casey's own behavior. The very thing that had outraged the public and convinced many of her guilt became, in the courtroom, a point of psychological debate. The prosecution saw her partying and lying as evidence of indifference or relief after the death of her daughter. Baez reframed it as a coping mechanism, a symptom of shame, a response to trauma, a pattern learned in a dysfunctional home. To some jurors, this explanation planted doubt. To others, it softened Casey's portrayal. In closing arguments, the prosecution framed the case as a tragic and preventable death concealed by a calculated attempt to hide the truth. They asked the jury to see the 31 days of lies as the clearest expression of guilt. They argued that no innocent mother behaves as Casey behaved, and that the only logical explanation for her silence was that she knew Caylee was dead because she had caused her death. The defense stood in stark contrast. Baez reminded the jury that they were not being asked to judge morality, but evidence. He told them that suspicion is not proof, that strange behavior is not murder, that the state wanted them to leap from possibility to certainty without the solid ground of forensic fact. And he repeated the phrase that would echo long after the trial ended: "If you don't know how she died, you cannot know who killed her." The jury deliberated for far less time than the public expected. When they returned, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. The verdict was read: not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter, guilty only of providing false information to law enforcement. The reaction was immediate and explosive. People outside the courthouse screamed in anger. Commentators across the country erupted in disbelief. Even those who believed Casey might be innocent struggled to reconcile her lies with the outcome. Inside the courtroom, Casey cried tears that were interpreted in 1,000 ways: relief, fear, shock. George Anthony stared downward, motionless. Cindy's hands shook as she pressed them to her face. The divide within the family and within the country had widened into a chasm. With the verdict, Casey became legally innocent. But in the public eye, the question of what happened to Caylee remained unresolved. The trial had not delivered closure. Instead, it exposed the cracks between truth and proof. The case demonstrated that a person can behave in ways that seem incriminating can lie in ways that appear damning, can act with indifference that feels immoral, and still walk free if the evidence cannot rise to the legal standard required for conviction. Many investigators concluded that the delay in reporting Caylee missing, combined with the Florida heat and the environmental erosion, destroyed the very evidence needed to determine how she died. Time had swallowed the truth before anyone could retrieve it, and time had become the strongest ally the defense could ever hope for. The trial ended, but the questions lingered. Why did Casey lie? Why did she not report Caylee missing? What happened in the hours between leaving her home and arriving at her boyfriend's apartment on June 16th? Why was duct tape placed where it was? Why was Caylee left in the woods so close to her home? These questions still haunt the narrative, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The story of the Casey Anthony trial is not just about guilt or innocence. It is about the limits of forensic science, the consequences of delayed reporting, and the flawed intersection between human behavior and legal judgment. It is a reminder that truth and justice do not always align, and that the absence of evidence can be as powerful as its presence.